Shuva Sham Asher Yisenu Kafikim Baneged Shuva Sham Asher Yisenu Kafikim Baneged Shuva Sham Asher Yisenu Kafikim Baneged Shuva Sham Asher Yisenu Kafikim Baneged
Oh, my holy sisters and brothers, what a beautiful song. That's from the band Zusha. It's called Shuva. Shuva Hashem es shivisenu kafikim banegev. Return the exiles to the Holy Land, Hashem, and we will be like water flowing through the dried up streams of the desert. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let us light up the darkness on this Erev Yom Kippur. We're getting ready for Yom Kippur. It begins tonight. Some people dread the fast. Makes sense. It's human. Everybody dreads fasting. But the davening, the praying of Yom Kippur is such an opportunity. We're going to beat our breasts. We're going to confess our guilt, not only as individuals, but as a nation, all the different things that we've done wrong. We're going to be wearing white. We're going to be wearing our prayer shawl at night tonight. It's all kinds of differences from every other prayer service. But there is an inherent underlying joy in this holiday of Yom Kippur. We're going to be up there like the angels. We're never going to be so high, perhaps, as we are on Yom Kippur. And what brings us up so high? The love of our Father in heaven. Who's going to be with us as we're studying a little Talmud today, getting ready for Yom Kippur tonight? Randy says Gemar Hasimatova from Florida. Sammy with us from Tacoma, Washington. Ed Bird from New Jersey. Donna Smith from Bahama, North Carolina. So good to see you. Christo says, greetings. I hope you all have a meaningful Yom Kippur tonight and tomorrow. Kathy from Minnesota. Rebecca from Atlanta. Charles from Louisiana. Juanita from Atlanta. Connie from California. Hasnain from Pakistan. Welcome, Hasnain. It's so great to have you with us. Sherry says, I'm not Jewish, but love to you and love to you back, Sherry. Stephanie says, Shana Tova Mituka, Akasiva Chatima Tova. Yes, we are This is the time, right? We're coming into that end of the 10-day period. Yom Kippur is 10 days after Rosh Hashanah. It's this whole 10-day period when our souls are on trial before the heavenly court. But we've got an inside track, right? It's not just an objective judge. It's a fair judge, but it's a judge who loves us. And so we have confidence that we'll receive the best decree possible for the coming year. Dana says shalom from Florida. Helena's with us from Finland. Anne is saying greetings from Merced, California. Melissa from Great Neck, New York. Patricia from Chicago. Rafi Khan is talking to somebody else. Stephen is with us from Dover, New Hampshire. Barbara wishing us a good Yom Kippur. Kathy says amen. Jose Luis, shalom from Tampa Bay. Seth from Ohio. Toby from Glen Ellen, Illinois. Deb from Philly. Lindsay from Cincinnati. And Portia is wishing us a Gemar Hasimatova. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn with us from Texas, Marjorie from Georgia, and Marasia also from Atlanta. All right, we've got some work to do. Let's get into it. Where are we holding? We are in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We've been generally studying the laws of boundaries and joining enclosures on Shabbos, either for the purpose of carrying from one domain to another or within a larger domain, or so that we can walk in a particular direction. because we want to get somewhere, and there's a limit on how far we can walk on Shabbos. But working within the law, we can make adjustments so that we can get to where we need to go. Always the purpose of these laws is so that we can fulfill two obligations. One, to guard Shabbos, so that we don't do any kind of work that's prohibited to do on Shabbos, but also so that we remember Shabbos, so that we honor Shabbos, so that we delight in Shabbos. And although Yom Kippur is very different from Shabbos in a lot of ways, it is also called a Shabbos Shabboson. In other words, like a Shabbat of Shabbats. It's related to Shabbos. We're certainly going to do no work. We're going to afflict ourselves in the sense that we're not going to eat, but we are going to rise. Even as we confess our sins and ask for forgiveness, there's a joy underlying this process. All right. Let's get into this. So Eruvin is generally about these enclosures, right? We're either moving our border or adjusting our border so that we can carry within it. We've been lately studying in this chapter 4, Mishna number 4, what happens to a person who is traveling on the road and they fall asleep before Shabbos begins. They probably didn't intend to fall asleep, be sleeping as Shabbos fell. They probably just were tired from the travel, wanted to take a nap, and slept much longer than they expected. And so they were sleeping and therefore unconscious when Shabbos began. They didn't have a Shabbos dwelling, because they're on the road, they're traveling. They probably intended to get to their destination where they were going to be for Shabbos, maybe a friend's house, maybe a hotel, an inn in the old days, but they didn't quite get there. So normally, if you're going to be on the side of the road or anywhere where you are when Shabbos is falling and you haven't established your dwelling elsewhere, well, then your Shabbos dwelling is going to be where you are when Shabbos begins, when twilight falls on Friday evening. This person was asleep, so the question was, does he acquire a Shabbos dwelling? In which case he could walk 2,000 cubits in any direction from that spot, which is now a Shabbos dwelling. Or does he not have a Shabbos dwelling at all, which is the equivalent of being outside his Shabbos dwelling, in which case he only gets 4 cubits from the place where he is. One of the things we're going to learn today is the source for this rabbinic thinking of you only get 4 cubits from the place where you are. But as we saw, we follow the lenient opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that even a person who is asleep acquires a dwelling and gets to walk 2,000 cubits in any direction from that point. However, the law does not follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's related ruling, which is that an ownerless object is like this unconscious sleeping person. An object that's not owned by anybody also gets a Shabbos dwelling, and so it can only be carried 2,000 cubits from that spot where it lay when Shabbos began. We don't follow that. The law accords with the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri on that point, and the ownerless object has no dwelling. Whoever picks it up can carry it anywhere where they are allowed to walk, presuming that carrying is going to be permitted according to some other circumstances. And this mattered in the case of water. As we saw, water, which in certain cases is ownerless, can somebody carry it further away than where they picked it up, than the 2,000 cubits, which would be the limit if water, which is ownerless, acquired its own dwelling at that spot. And the rabbis said, no, something that is ownerless does not acquire a dwelling, and its limit of how far it can go is according to the person who picked it up and who is permitted to carry it. It can be carried as far as that person is allowed to walk on Shabbos. The question is then asked, okay, ownerless objects do not acquire a Shabbos dwelling. What about and we know that objects owned by a Jew are going to have the same Shabbos boundary, are going to have the same dwelling and therefore the same boundary as the Jew who owns that object. What about an object that is owned by a non-Jew? Why is there a difference? You might think that there's a difference because the Jew has a Shabbos boundary. He is limited how far he is permitted to walk according to the law on Shabbos. A non-Jew is not obligated to observe Shabbos according to Jewish law. He has no Shabbos boundary. So then the question is, so an object owned by the non-Jew who himself is not obligated in a 2,000 cubit, walking limit, hit 2,000 cubit Shabbos boundary, do his possessions have such a boundary? And the answer is yes, they do. Why does this matter? Because it might happen that the non-Jew wants to give a gift or present something, do a favor to his Jewish friend, and he gives him something that is going to be useful to him on Shabbos. So let's say that the Jew is already, when he acquires this object or gets this water or whatever it is that the non-Jew gives him, he's already walked from his Shabbos dwelling quite a bit, and now he wants to go back the way he came and go even further than his own dwelling, so more than 2,000 cubits from the place where the non-Jew gave him this object. Can he carry that object all the way to his friend's house at the other end of his own Shabbos boundary, therefore carrying it more than 2,000 cubits from the place that the non-Jew gave it to him? And the answer is no, he cannot. The object belonging to the non-Jew is just like an object belonging to a Jew. So a Jew can't give another Jew an object on Shabbos that the recipient could then carry more than the 2,000 cubits from the dwelling of the one who gave it to him, whether the giver is a Jew or a non-Jew. And the chiddush of that, the novelty of it, what's surprising about it, is that this is so even though the non-Jew does not have a Shabbos boundary. He can walk wherever he wants on Shabbos, but the objects that belong to him when Shabbos began, will acquire a boundary with respect to Jewish law. That's the principle. And then we have an incident that came, and that law, by the way, is according to Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan, who said that while ownerless objects do not acquire a Shabbos boundary, objects owned by a non-Jew, just like objects owned by a Jew, do acquire the boundary according to the dwelling of the person who owned it. Okay? So here we go. So there was an incident where some Gentile shepherds who were not Jewish, brought some rams, okay, so some sheep, male sheep, to the town of Mavrachta on Shabbos. And they had established relationships with the people of this town. I think maybe the situation was something like the shepherds would come to town every so often. They would come out of the hills and they would bring sheep to sell to the townspeople. So they came on their schedule when it was convenient for them. They're not Jewish. So sometimes they would come on Shabbos. Now, when they came on Shabbos, they were aware that the Jewish residents of the town would not be able to purchase from them. They were only going to be in town for a day. They didn't want to wait till after Shabbos in order to make sales of their sheep to the Jews. But they had already, sort of gotten to know these people over a long period of time. And so what they would do is actually they would just leave the sheep with the Jews because the relationship was so good. They knew that they would get a fair price and they would get it after Shabbos or maybe the next time they came through town. And they didn't have to, and they knew that the Jewish residents of Mavrachta could not pay for the sheep on Shabbos and couldn't even talk about the price, couldn't negotiate. They couldn't enter into any kind of purchase and sale agreements because it's Shabbos. We don't do business on Shabbos. But it was much more convenient for these shepherds to leave the sheep there then when they were coming through town. And so that's what they did. They would just leave the sheep with the Jews, knowing that when they came back later in the week, they would get a fair price and the Jews would pay, right? Both the price and the payment would be in order. It just couldn't be handled on Shabbos. So Rava permitted this state of affairs, this situation, and also permitted the residents of a nearby town where actually Rava lived called Mechoza, right? So the non-Jewish shepherds would bring these sheep to Mavrachta, leave the sheep there not only for the residents of Mavrachta, but also for residents of Mechoza. And the people from Mechoza would come over to Mavrachta, pick up the sheep left for them, and then walk back with them on Shabbos to Mechoza. And Rava permitted that as well. Ravina said to Rava, I'm not so sure you've thought this through. What is your reasoning here? You must be relying on that teaching, which was taught by Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that objects belonging to a non-Jew do not acquire a Shabbos dwelling. And therefore, at any point when a Jew sort of acquires that object on Shabbos, so then he can walk it as far as is permitted for him, for the Jew. Right? So in that case, it was possible for the people from Mechoza to walk those sheep back to, it must be that Mechoza was within 2,000 cubits of Mavrachta. And so they could walk their sheep back to Mechoza. But, says Ravina, so you're saying a teaching that these objects owned by a Gentile are like ownerless objects, and therefore they acquire the boundary of the person who is taking them. But actually, Rabbi Yochanan issued a ruling, which we just heard a moment ago, that objects belonging to a Gentile at the outset of Shabbos acquire a Shabbos dwelling at the place where they are, at the dwelling of the Gentile, and can only go 2,000 cubits from there. With that situation in mind, they could be brought into Mavrachta, but they're not going to be able to walk all the way to Mechoza. And so therefore, what are you doing? Says Ravina to Rava. And Rava, who's the great Rava, really great sage, but who's very humble when it comes to, the law is the law, the truth is the truth, and it doesn't matter that he issued a ruling. He realized he was wrong. And he said, you're right. So what's going to happen here is the residents of Mavrachta, they can continue this relationship. Why? Because when the shepherds bring these sheep into Mavrachta, they're going to be outside because they're being brought from even more than 2,000 cubits away from Mavrachta. So once they're brought into Mavrachta, they're outside. The sheep are outside of the Shabbos dwelling established by those non-Jewish shepherds at the outset of Shabbos the night before, right? They've been walking a long way. So once an object or a person is outside its Shabbos border, as we learned, it's limited to its 4 cubits. It can only move 4 cubits. Why is it going to be okay for these residents of Mavrachta to take the sheep home? Because it's all in their city. And as we learn, if a person finds himself outside his Shabbos boundary, he only has 4 cubits. But if those 4 cubits are inside an enclosed city, so then they can wander around the whole city. They can roam the city. So it works for the residents of Mavrachta. But for the citizens of Mechoza, who would have to leave the city limits of Mavrachta and transport these sheep all the way over to Mechoza, it's not going to work. And so Rava said, okay, so the residents of Mavrachta, they can receive these sheep and pay for it later after Shabbos, but the citizens of Mechoza can't receive them at all. It does not work for them. If you have questions or comments on this, please put in the questions and comments, and I'll get to it near the end. It should not be a very long class today. There was another incident, and by the way, did I mention why I'm wearing white? Because it's Yom Kippur tonight, and this is how we dress for Yom Kippur. There's a purity and a joy to it. And it's also a little bit reminiscent of, this is what we would be buried in. When life ends, a Jew is buried in simple shrouds. I wouldn't have the shirt underneath, just the shroud. And this is called a kittel that we wear at Yom Kippur and Passover and somewhere on Rosh Hashanah as well. But it's again, we're just sort of leaving the world behind. We're going to be so elevated up like the angels. We get as close to the angels as it's possible to get in this world on Yom Kippur. Continuing. There was another incident where Rabbi Hiyya taught in a baraisa that a water-filled ditch, which lies on the edge between 2 Sabbath boundaries, right? So you can imagine that it kind of works out that there's 2 towns, that their city limits are exactly 4,000 cubits apart. And the middle happens to lie right on a water-filled ditch, right? So for the people of both towns, if they go exactly the limit of how far they can go, 2,000 cubits from their city limit, they end up at a water-filled ditch. It splits the line between the two boundaries. And so the question is, may they draw water from that ditch? That's the question that's being asked. Rabbi Hiyya says, a water-filled ditch on the edge of two Shabbos boundaries requires an iron partition down the middle of the ditch so that the people on each side can draw water from that ditch and take it back where they came from. Now, this is assuming that you have also the other kind of Eruv, right? The Eruv Chatzeros that would permit you to carry. There's some kind of enclosure here, because otherwise you can't carry out in the field, which is like a Carmelis or in a public domain where you can't carry on Shabbos. But the idea here is that there's going to be an enclosure around this whole thing, and this ditch is being used as part of the enclosure, and so they're going to be able to carry water. You can even ask, can they draw water at all from the ditch and even to carry it 4 cubits in their direction? It's a different question. The question here, though, is not so much about carrying it back to the city. It's, can they take it out of the ditch at all? That's what's really being asked, because this water came from outside their boundary, right? Because the line is right down the middle, some of that water is coming from outside their 2,000 cubit Shabbos boundary. So the question is, can they draw water out of it? So Rabbi Hiyya says, there has to be an iron partition down the middle of that ditch so that you're not pulling water from outside your boundary. You're only drawing water from the ditch that's within your boundary. That's Rabbi Hiyya's ruling. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, laughed. He laughed at Rabbi Hiyya's ruling. So the question that the Gemara asks, that the Talmud asks, why did Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, laugh at Rabbi Hiyya's ruling? So we're going to look at 4 possibilities of why he laughed, and we're going to reject the first 3. So the first possibility is, Rabbi Hiyya held, according to the stringent opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, as we saw, that an ownerless object acquires that 2,000 cubit Shabbos boundary. It acquires a dwelling and a boundary and a limit, and therefore, hold on a second, and therefore it can't be brought out as far as you need it to go. Whereas Rabbi Yosei holds, according to the lenient opinion of the rabbis, that ownerless objects don't acquire their own boundary, rather they acquire the walking limit of the person who draws them. And so, so the person can draw water. But just the fact that Rabbi Hiyya subscribes to a stringent opinion and Rabbi Yosei subscribes to a lenient opinion, it's just a disagreement. That's not a reason to laugh at Rabbi Hiyya's ruling. So the Gemara rejects this reasoning. The second reason, flowing rivers and streaming springs are like the feet of people. Because this water is flowing in the ditch, at the outset of Shabbos, it was in motion. It couldn't have acquired a Shabbos dwelling. Therefore, it can't have a limit of how far it can be carried. And therefore, the person who draws it out of the ditch he can carry it as far as he himself is permitted to walk. And that's why Rabbi Hiyya's ruling does not apply. But that's not really a reason to laugh, because not only is it not that funny, but also because we don't know that this water was flowing. Perhaps this is a ditch of collected water and the water is standing water, and so it was in its place at the outset of Shabbos. Third reason that Rabbi Hiyya might have been laughing, because Rabbi Hiyya said an iron partition is needed, and Rabbi Yosei might be saying, what do you need iron for? Won't a partition made out of reeds be sufficient? Perhaps Rabbi Hiyya thinks that reeds are not sufficient because the water flows through the reeds, and he wants a real hard barrier between both sides of the ditch so that the water can cross through. But does an iron... But does an iron... I just want to have this in front of me. But does an iron barrier actually prevent water from going from one side of the ditch to the other? No, because how big is this barrier going to be that it would even have that possibility? Water's going to get over the barrier, around the barrier. It's going to move through the silt under the barrier. There's no way that you can count on this iron barrier in the water, in the ditch, to prevent the waters on either side from mixing, right? This iron partition won't separate water from water. I just mentioned that, and that's why I titled today's show, God separates water from water. Can we? God separated water from water on the second day of creation. He separated the upper waters from the lower waters. How did he do that? With a firmament. And what is the firmament? The sky, right? So the sky, our sky, separates between upper waters and lower waters. Obvious, and these waters pre-existed the sun and the moon and the heavenly bodies. So what are these upper and lower waters? It's not physical water. It's spiritual water, right? And this is where we get this impression, which I firmly subscribe to, that the spiritual world it's not like the physical world at all. Everything is much more fluid there. Everything is made out of this kind of flowing light and energy, and everything is fluid. Reality is not so fixed and static the way it is here. The glory of our world is that this is a bell, it remains a bell, I can knock on it, it's still a bell. Whereas up there in the world of souls, where we come from and where we will return to, everything is always fluid and changing all the time. That's why the stakes are so high when we come here, because everything is so intense. There's so much energy in it. It's actually basic physics, right? This seems solid, but actually this is made out of energy and particles that have assumed this rigid place. But there's tremendous energy in every physical object in this world. Normally we don't think about this stuff, and there's no need to. But it's interesting coincidence that we're talking about separating from water from water, just as Yom Kippur is coming tonight, right? And where our souls are going to elevate so high, and especially by the end of tomorrow, when we've been fasting for nearly over 24 hours, and we're just a little bit out of our heads, and we're praying and singing. Hopefully, we have an outdoor minyan so we can get together and sing, and we're just going to rise up so high and just get a taste of that upper world. That's possible on Yom Kippur. At any rate, we're still analyzing the question, why did Rabbi Yosei laugh at Rabbi Hiyya's ruling about separating water from water with an iron partition? So the fact that an iron partition really won't separate water from water, the water will get around it. So maybe what Rabbi Hiyya was saying was, it would require an iron partition. You can't really separate with an iron partition. So the fact is, this situation won't work. If the ditch is right on the boundary between two Shabbos boundaries, people are not going to be allowed to draw water from it. But that is not so. And so the fourth explanation is that Rabbi Yosei laughed because it is possible to separate water from water symbolically. All we need is a partition of reeds, some kind of a partition in the middle of the water, but it doesn't have to be solid. Water can get through it. It can be made of reeds, and it can even be a suspended partition that doesn't reach all the way to the bottom of the ditch. We're just symbolically separating the waters of one boundary from the waters of the other. And with that, it's going to be possible to draw the water, which is ownerless and therefore doesn't acquire Shabbos dwelling, and it will acquire the Shabbos boundary of the person who draws water from the ditch. With that discussion ending, we return very briefly to our Mishnah about the person who fell asleep on the road. And we saw Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says he acquires a dwelling and he can walk 2,000 cubits in any direction. But everybody else disagrees with him. The rabbis say you get 4 cubits. The Rabbi Yehuda says you get 4 cubits, and Rabbi Eliezer says you get 4 cubits. What is the difference between their 3 rulings? In our Mishnah, the rabbis say you get 4 cubits in any direction. It's really a circle with a diameter of 8 cubits. You can walk 4 cubits in any direction. It's still very little. 4 cubits is about 6 feet. So so your circles, you can go 6 feet that way or 6 feet that way, but it's still very limiting. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's 4 cubits. It's not 4 cubits in any direction. The whole circle is 4 cubits. But you can walk 4 cubits that way or 4 cubits that way. It's just that if you choose to go 4 cubits that way, you can no longer go that way. You just chose to look at yourself as on the edge of the circle, and your circle is over there. Rabbi Eliezer says you don't even get that choice. Where you wake up when you realize it's Shabbos is you get 4 cubits, and you're in the middle of your 4 cubits, so you can only go 2 cubits in either direction. And then our daf, this page, we've been talking so much about a person gets 4 cubits. Where do we get that? It comes from this page here, right? That a person on Shabbos who's outside his boundary gets 4 cubits. There's other rules for why you get 4 cubits. A person's place is considered to be 4 cubits. We have a teaching that since the age of prophecy ended, God is only revealed in this world in the 4 cubits where a person is studying Torah. So right now, you and I are studying together, and it's like God is being revealed. A little piece of God is being revealed as if through prophecy, but it's through Torah study. My 4 cubits is right here, and your 4 cubits is wherever you're sitting. This is when we're engaged in learning Torah. It's like a little bit 1/60th of prophecy is happening right here. That 1/60th of prophecy is actually when we dream. That's considered 1/60th of prophecy. But we also have this teaching that since the age of prophecy ended, the only place that God is revealed in this world is the 4 cubits where somebody is studying Torah. Okay. But in terms of where we get this idea of 4 cubits, the Gemara answers, as it was taught in a Baraisa, the verse from Exodus 16:29, we mentioned it yesterday, every man shall remain in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day, right? When we were in the desert eating the manna, on the 6th day, on Friday, there was a double portion that we could gather so that we wouldn't have to gather on Saturday. So then on Saturday, since we don't go out and gather, we can stay in our place. And then from there, we're going to get 2,000 cubits. But what is the place itself? That's going to be defined as 4 cubits. Why? And how much is the area of his place? A person's body typically measures 3 cubits. This is kind of interesting. I mean, he's typically about 3 cubits tall, right? Or is he saying wide? You know, it's like about from here to here. I mean, if that's 1.5 feet, okay, so that's 4.5 feet. That's a very short person. So maybe they're saying a person is about 4.5 feet wide, maybe when you kind of spread your arms out. A person's body typically measures 3 cubits, and an additional cubit is needed in order to allow him to spread out his hands and feet. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So maybe it's more like when you're sitting, you kind of occupy 3 cubits and you need a little extra just so you can move your hands and feet around. Rabbi Yehuda says a person's body measures 3 cubits and an additional cubit is needed in order to allow him to pick up an object from under his feet and place it under his head, meaning to give him room to maneuver. Under your head, now that implies that one is lying down. So however you reason it, a person gets about 4 cubits as their personal space. Right, so the rabbis, I guess we talk about this a lot, like Americans have a larger personal space. They don't like to be up close and touching people the way in other cultures they don't mind being so close together. But here the rabbis are defining that a person's personal space is 4 cubits, right? So sort of like a circle with a 2-cubit radius. Rabbi Misharsha said to his son, when you go before Rav Papa, so his son was going to go off and study and learn Torah with Rav Papa. So Rav Misharsha said, when you get to him, ask him, when we say that a person has 4 cubits, how does this account for a very large person, right? What if we're talking about Og, the king, right? That is the king of Bashan, right? Who's written about in the Torah. There was a war with him when we were in the wilderness, and he was so big. You know, according to which sources you're reading, the king of Bashan, his name was Og, and some say he was 9 feet tall, and some say he was 20 feet tall. I mean, he's just a giant, enormous guy. So if we're saying that a cubit is from the elbow to the tip of the hand, the finger, well, for Og, that's going to be quite a bit bigger. Now, he's going to need that because he is bigger, so he needs a bigger personal space. So Rav Misharsha is saying to his son, when you get to Rav Papa, ask him, so does a big person get his personal space defined by an extra large cubit, Or do we say that when donations are made to the temple in Jerusalem, when the temple is standing in ancient Israel, and when things were consecrated and donated to the temple, or when they were doing construction at the temple, for that they had a standard cubit, a standard measure. And it was meant to make sure that anything that was built for the temple was according to temple standards, and that a person did not mistakenly appropriate something that belonged to the temple just by building it a little smaller than it should have been. So they didn't use the sort of temple cubit throughout the land. You might think, well, it would have been better if they just had standard measures throughout the land. They didn't. But for matters involving the temple, yes, they had the standard cubit. So Rav Misharsh is saying to his son, when you go to Rav Papa and learn from him, ask him, does a giant get his own cubit, or is he using the same temple cubit as other people? So Rav Misharsh's son came before Rav Papa and asked this question, and Rav Papa said, listen, I understand your question. It's a well-intended question. It's an interesting question. It's a good question. But if we get so caught up in these kinds of details and exactly which cubit and how long, it's never going to end. We're never going to get to substantive Torah because we're going to be so caught up in these little measures. But of course, the Gemara doesn't leave it there. It says, and the answer is, because the Talmud is always interested in all kinds of, precision whenever possible. Some things are just impossible to arrive at a precise answer. But whenever it's possible, the Talmud is interested because those liminal cases, those little borderline cases, are actually sometimes the most interesting cases where we're really trying to figure out, well, what does God want us to do as we approach the edge of what's permitted and what's prohibited? So how do we define that edge? The more we understand what the edge between prohibited and permitted, or obligated and permitted, or obligated and prohibited, the better we understand that line, that edge, the better we understand God's will generally, and the more we understand how to conduct ourselves in this world. And so the Gemara does give an answer, and the answer is, for a giant, of course he needs a bigger cubit so that he has those 4 cubits of space to move around, and so we give him a bigger cubit. But for a very small person, that could be like a really small measure, especially if it's a person who is a large body but small arms. This is going to be too much of a stringency. It's going to make his life difficult. So for him, he can use the standard cubit measure of the temple so that this law won't be overly restrictive for him. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us look at comments and questions. Sharon Frant Brooks. Are these instances hypothetical, or are they actually real circumstances people are bringing to the sages for reconciliation? In the case of the ditch between 2 boundaries, that seems to me hypothetical, because that would really take a lot of conditions to work exactly right for that question to come up. So I think there it was more, Rabbi Yosei was saying, Rabbi Hiyya, it's interesting what he brought up, but for his hypothetical case, he was too stringent in the answer because we have other principles that are just much more easygoing, and that's how we would resolve such a case. For the incident of the sheep being brought to Mavrachta, I just never heard that town's name before, Mavrachta, and then being sold, being given to the Jews with the monies to be collected after Shabbos, that was a real incident. And Ravina brought to Rava's attention that there was a problem with his ruling, and so Rava revised his ruling. So I think that was a good story, a good example of, the sort of chief rabbi of a pious community explaining to his people how they should conduct themselves on Shabbos, and then making an adjustment when he realized that he didn't have all of the law, he hadn't applied the law correctly in that situation. Again, all these rules are only going to apply to pious people who submit to them, right? There's no enforcer going around and making sure that this isn't happening. There's always going to be sort of renegade Jews who, don't subscribe to this. But for the people who want to submit, and as I've said many times, to have real freedom in this world, as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. You're either going to serve your own lusts and ever-changing ideas of what right and wrong are, or you're going to submit to eternal values and to the will of your Creator. And then it's astounding how much freedom you have when you realize that You're submitting to the will of one who sent you here for a particular mission that only you can accomplish. You are a special, unique soul, a child of God, an expression of God, and you were sent here to accomplish something that only you can accomplish. And when you submit to that, it's very uplifting, inspiring, and empowering. Lynn in Texas says, I think I remember earlier that the objects beyond the techem also came up when fruits and vegetables coming in were considered available or unavailable, considering that status. I believe you're right. That does sound familiar. And Lynn also says, it seems like all creation is accepting an observance of Sabbath domains, except any human being who has not done so. Crazy summation. You mean somebody who just declares that they don't submit to the boundary, then technically they would only get the 4 cubits, right? But yeah, I mean, for people who are subscribing to these laws, they get, where there's a great variance is you get 2,000 cubits from your dwelling, but as we've seen, if your dwelling is in a city, you get the whole city as your 4 cubits, as your place, and then 2,000 cubits beyond that. And then we're seeing that objects that are ownerless, just whoever they get picked up by, objects that are owned get the same dwelling and therefore boundary as the person who owns them, whether the owner is a Jew or a non-Jew. And what's interesting about that is that the non-Jew doesn't have his own Sabbath limit. He can walk wherever he wants, and his objects will go wherever he wants to take them. But if he gives an object to a Jew on Shabbos, the Jew can only take it 2,000 cubits from where that object owned by the non-Jew was resting when Shabbos began. All right, that's what I've got for us today. My blessing to you, my holy sisters and brothers, is that this Yom Kippur that's coming in tonight, it should be elevated. It should be soulful. You should tap into that underlying happiness that is beyond the fasting and affliction, right? That we want to get to that place. So it's like we're going to starve our bodies so that we can connect to the real driver of the body. The problem is, our souls come into this world to fulfill a mission, but part of the mission is you're going to forget the mission. You're going to be born in a human manifestation. You're going to grow up in this world of humans and do what humans do. And the human that you're riding around in with all its animal desires and wants and needs and emotions and craziness, meshugas, is going to be in charge, right? And what we're always trying to do, and this is what happens when we submit to the will of God, it's like then we're handing the reins of the human vessel to the soul that we want to be in charge, right? The human is always just taking control to its detriment. But if we can somehow remember who we really are, that we're souls, right? We don't have souls, we are souls. We have bodies, but we're riding around in these bodies in a state of amnesia and just letting the body do whatever it wants to do. But when we start to remember who we are, and the way we can do that is to connect with God and to pray for help in this, and to pray and to give to tzedakah, charity, and to make teshuvah, right? To sort of recognize all that ways in which the body has strayed and erred and created problems in the past year. And when we recognize all the problems that the body created, all the sins we committed, all the troubles that the body created, all the ways we let down the people we love and care about and that we wish we hadn't let them down, when we recognize those things, that awareness allows us to hone in on, well, those are the sins are, the body committed the sins, right? Like the animal mentality, the animal soul, the animal nature of the soul in a body is the one who sort of pulled for all those things. But I am really a holy soul, and I wouldn't do those things if I was in charge. I, the soul. So once you recognize the stuff that's sort of unsoul-like, then what's left is the soul. And that's why Yom Kippur is this wonderful opportunity to connect with your soul, remember who you really are. And at some point toward the end of Yom Kippur, when you're feeling that a little more than usual, that's a good time to say, okay, this is me. This is who I really am. Why did I come into this world? What is the mission that only I can accomplish? To ask that question is to come much closer to the answer than not asking the question. May you have a sweet, meaningful, revealed Yom Kippur.